We're a few days removed from UFC 303, and there's a lot of things that happen on this event that I was not a fan of, and that's what we're going to talk about in today's video. My name is James Lynch. Now, it's not all going to be negative stuff in this video, and I'm certainly not a I hate UFC guy, but I do think there's times when the UFC deserves to be criticized, and I think there's some things that happen on this card that I think are worth discussing, and that's what I'm going to get into in today's video. But just wanted to mention that this isn't about I hate the UFC. I think there's some good things that came out of this card. There's also a lot of bad things as well. And let's start first with this whole talk going into the event about how this card was better than the original Conor McGregor card. I saw Daniel Cormier push it. He did a video on this. I saw some media members mention it. I disagree. When Conor McGregor is on a card, it is a bigger deal, whether you love him or hate him, or I don't care what you think about Conor McGregor. When he is on an event, it is a bigger event. So him being out was unfortunate. Injuries happen. I know the UFC can't predict injuries and cards being shuffled, but one of the things UFC could have done in this situation was make a better card. If you remember initially, prior to all the switch ups, it was going to be Conor McGregor and Michael Chandler and Jamal Hill and initially Khalil Roundtree. They ended up going with Carlos Ulberg, and we know Hill ended up being out and then Ulberg being out. There's a lot of changes, but those are the only two notable fights that were on this card. They ended up booking Ian Gary and Michael Venom Page, which was a good start, but it needed at least 2 or 3 more good fights. And I think if these injuries had happened, we would have been in a better spot. And I'm personally not a fan of fighters having fights on short notice just to save a card. I don't think it's necessary in a lot of cases. I think what the better method is to just make cards a little bit stronger, and then that way you're going to have more options when the time comes. So that was something going in that kind of bothered me a bit, that we were sort of being sold on this is a better card than the original card. It was not in my opinion. When Conor McGregor's on a card, the card is better. I'm going to fight that point till the day I die probably. So I just wanted to point that out as well. And also I was in Vegas for this card, so I can tell you right now, this did not feel like a big card like I've been at other fights in the past. I thought 300 felt bigger than this. There's just other cards that I've been to where you can just tell it's a bigger deal. I didn't really get that sense from this card, but let's talk about what actually happened on this event as well. One of the things that, I don't see a lot of people talking about, everyone's talking about Alex Pereira and his performance, and all the credit to him. Highlight reel finish. There's big things ahead here for Alex Pereira. But what about Yuri Prochazka? He's in a really, really bad position right now, in my opinion here. So, Yuri takes this fight on short notice. He did take a decent amount of damage in that fight with Alexander Rakic despite getting the win. I know Pereira had to travel as well. Kind of what I'm getting at is that this was not an ideal fight to put together on short notice, in my opinion. I know it saved the card, and I know the people that bought tickets and maybe couldn't get refunds were happy about it. I understand all that. But I think the UFC has a bad habit sometimes of putting together fights at the last minute when they could be fights that they could really build up. Prime example, last year we had Islam and Volkanovski, the rematch. That ended up in a knockout win for Islam, but that's a fight they could have spent months building up the rematch, and both fighters could have had full camps. I think it's the same way here. I mean, we just had this fight in November. Yuri got knocked out. I'm not saying if Yuri had a full camp, he would have won, but I think this is the type of fight that deserved a bigger buildup than a short notice fight. And again, if the UFC had put together a better card from the get-go, I should say, with McGregor and Chandler, I don't think you need to put this type of fight together at the last minute. And I think Yuri's in a tough spot. So now he's lost 2 fights to Pereira. There's talk. I've heard some fans talk about him dropping the middleweight. There was some of that talk after his last fight with Alexander Rakic. But for a guy who's 6'3" with an 80-inch reach, I mean, I've been around Yuri. He's a big guy. Maybe he can make the weight, but is that really the best idea for someone who gets hit a lot in his fights? You're cutting a lot of weight. I don't think it is. So I don't think middleweight's a good option here for Yuri, and he's not going to get a title shot anytime soon as long as Alex is champion. I've heard some people mention, well, Pereira's a bit older. He's going to be 37 here soon. He might move up. Who knows what's going to happen? I don't know. That's still a tough spot to be in. It reminds me a bit of when Robert Whittaker was sort of in his limbo after losing 2 fights to Izzy. We had the same situation with Max Holloway. Now that is seemingly worked out for them as time has gone on, but there's no guarantee that Pereira is going to leave light heavyweight. There's no guarantee he fights at heavyweight. In fact, Dana White, after the press conference, kind of felt like Pereira needed some more work to do. So is the timing going to line up? I personally think Yuri should stay at light heavyweight, but if he does, where does he go from here? Where does his career go if he's not going to be able to fight for a belt again? You rarely see a fighter lose 2 fights decisively like Yuri did, both finishes, and get that third fight. I just don't see that happening. So again, a little bit short-sighted by the UFC on Yuri's end, because Yuri's he's not a huge draw, but he's someone that fans are excited to watch, and I just don't know what you really do with him if he's not going to be able to fight for a title. So that's something I don't see a lot of people talk about. Everyone's talking about Pereira and the great things that he did, and certainly he deserves his credit, and I know the UFC paid him very well. We heard about the $300K bonus on the MMA Hour that was mentioned by Pereira's coach. That's all awesome. And the other thing too that I kind of bothered me about this fight is Rogan's talking about him moving to heavyweight. He's had 2 title defenses. Like, I get it. You want to see Pereira challenge, and I think it would be certainly interesting him moving up. But 2 title defenses and you already want to see him move up to heavyweight? How is that fair to any of the other heavyweight fighters on the roster? I don't think it makes a lot of sense. And how about Magomed Ankalaev? They didn't even mention him on the broadcast. And look, I know Ankalaev, maybe not the best choice of words about him saying he wants to fight Pereira in the Middle East. I understand all that, but they got to do that fight. Like, I know there's going to be fans who don't want to see Ankalaev and Pereira. I've also heard fans argue that, oh, Ankalaev doesn't have any good wins. That's all nonsense. It's a fresh matchup. I think it poses an interesting challenge here to Pereira. That's got to get mentioned more. And I know Rogan's a fan like the rest of us, but you got to bring up Ankalaev as a future opponent here for Pereira. And I didn't hear that. I kept hearing Rogan talking about, Pereira moving up. So listen, at some point, I'd like to see Pereira move up to heavyweight. I'm with Dana White here. I think Pereira's got more work to do in the light heavyweight division. So that's another thing that I think I don't see a lot of people talking about as well. So sort of overall on this, I think Yuri's in a tough spot. I think rematches like this, there should be more of a buildup instead of a short notice fight. And again, I think Ankalaev's the guy to sort of mention there as well. Okay, so that's the main event. Co-main event, Diego Lopez and Dan Ige. So again, this was initially supposed to be Diego Lopez and Brian Ortega. Ortega, clearly, you could even see it at Media Day, was having a tough cut. They changed the fight to 55, and then Ortega's out of the fight, and then they bring Dan Ige on hours' notice to get this fight done. What would have happened if Diego Lopez lost this fight? To me, again, another short-sighted move here by the UFC, where if Lopez had lost, all that momentum he built up, and you think of the audience he has, he's Brazilian, he's Mexican as well. I mean, there's a lot of potential here for Diego Lopez. If he would have lost this fight, I mean, that would have been really kind of all this buildup wasted if Ige would have won. Now, thankfully, Lopez did win the fight. Ige will go down as a legend. I think that's the only coolest part here is that, hey, Ige stepped up. We'll probably never see a situation like that again where a fighter's already been training for a fight. He lives in Vegas. He can make the weight. It was all good. But, I mean, personally, I think it would have just been better to cancel the fight. Now, is that fair to the fans? No, but like Lopez was in sort of a no-win situation. If he says no, he'll be, the UFC is going to be upset with them. Remember Wonderboy not fighting Michelle Pereira. And for Ige, he had nothing to lose. But, I mean, if he would have won, what would that have said? Because it was a 165-pound fight. So, again, I know fans think this whole thing was cool. I was not really a fan of it. I just thought, okay, if Ortega can't do it, let's get rid of this fight. But, the fight happened. Lopez ended up winning a decision. And I still see people criticizing Lopez. Oh, he didn't look that good. You realize when you fight someone on 3 hours notice that you haven't prepared for, you're probably not going to look your best. So that's another thing too. Like, I think, I had Lopez as high on the stock report video I did. There's people who disagreed and said, no, his stock went down. This is what I mean. Like, this was created because the UFC couldn't find a good co-main event and they had to put this fight together at the last minute. And the last thing I'll say on this fight too, is that now everyone's crapping on Brian Ortega. Oh, Ortega, unprofessional, couldn't make the weight. Do I think Ortega should have given Lopez more of a heads up? I do, although according to Lopez at the post-fight presser, he mentioned that he got plenty of notice that the fight could be changed to 55. But we know Ortega cuts a lot of weight. Like, could they have not given Lopez a different opponent than Ortega if you know all that? Like, to me, it was like Ortega kind of had to say yes to this fight. And now all the fans are like turning on him and saying all this different stuff when it's like Ortega tried to make the fight. Like, I actually have sympathy for him. You could tell he was sick. It's not like he, pulled out of the fight because of like any other issue. Like, he tried to make 145, but it just wasn't happening. Tried to make 155. He wasn't cleared. So again, all this is created because UFC couldn't find a suitable fight to put as the co-main event. That's again, like we have, we have people talking about Ige being a legend when it's like, that was just a weird scenario. And then you've got people like hating on Ortega now because he couldn't make the fight. But the reality is it's pretty tough to make 145 if you're a pretty big guy for the weight class. Not to mention Ortega was mentioning about moving up a weight class to fight at lightweight. So obviously the cut really did have an impact on him and he couldn't get to fight. So I just feel bad for Brian Ortega here because, like, to a certain degree, like, he tried to help out the UFC and now he's getting crap for it because he couldn't make it. But at the same time, it was short notice. So that's another thing that, again, kind of annoyed me about this card is that everyone's crapping on Ortega. People are crapping on Lopez. Oh, he didn't look good in the third round. Well, again, that's going to happen when you're fighting on 3 hours notice and everything else. And like I said, I think the UFC dodged a bullet because if Lopez would have lost, yes, the fight's at 165, but fans would say, oh, he's exposed, So again, that was a bit risky. Luckily, it worked out for the UFC with him winning. Okay, now some things I did like about this card. I thought the Joe Pyfer and Marc-Andre Barriault was good matchmaking, showcased Pyfer, getting a highlight reel finish win, coming off that disappointing loss to Jack Hermanson. That was something too, where, you know, again, like they needed Piper to go out there and have a good performance. Now people are excited about him again and wanted to see him matched up. So I thought that was very good in terms of what the UFC was able to do. And also I thought the ending might have not been the fan for everyone, but the Chasson and Bueno Silva fight was actually pretty entertaining prior to the cut. And listen, I know people don't like fights being ended by cuts. It was a pretty bad cut. I think that was the right call. But Chasson getting the win, I mean, this is a sort of a dark horse in the weight class now. So I think that kind of worked out well. So again, the matchmaking here was good. They both had full camps. Good matchmaking here by the UFC, both these fights. Just wanted to mention that so people don't think I'm totally just being a hater in this video. Now let's talk about the Ian Gary fight. Again, good matchmaking here as well. I'll do probably a separate video on this, but Gary, talking about his performance, literally, it's like he took something out of the Conor McGregor page book explaining his performance against Venom Page. He barely won this fight. And look, it was good to see some ground game shown and all that, but I was not super impressed with Gary in this fight. And again, this has nothing to do with UFC. I just don't see a lot of people criticizing Ian Gary for this performance other than maybe the fans. I don't see a lot of media talking about, hey, he barely got by Michael Venom Page, a fight he was supposed to win. And it's not like he lit the world on fire. So that's more of where I'm criticizing that fight. But as far as the matchmaking goes, I think the fight was actually good. It's too bad Colby couldn't take the fight. I mean, that would have been a lot more excitement to this card. That would have been a better fight. So I don't know what's going on with Colby. That whole thing kind of was a bit weird there. So yeah, that's my thoughts kind of on the Gary stuff. Okay, let's talk about the prelims here quickly, and some stuff that I wasn't a huge fan of that I think kind of got, the people aren't talking about. So Gene Silva gets this huge win over Charles Jourdain. And I've heard people now say, oh, future champion and all this stuff. Look, first guy to knock out Charles Jourdain in the UFC. In fact, I think that might have been Charles Jourdain's first knockout loss period. Yeah, his first knockout loss period. Very good win. Just one problem with this, and I don't see a lot of people mentioning this. He missed weight. He missed weight in this fight, so it's great that he went out there and did that, but if you don't make weight, to me, there's like a bit of an asterisk on this fight. Now, you got to make the weight. I believe this fight was announced a little bit later, so that may have been part of the reason why he had trouble making weight. I don't think Silva's missed weight before. Could be wrong about that. But again, that's something else you don't see people talking about. They talk about how great Gene Silva is. He missed weight. So to me, that puts a damper on this performance, and that's something I think that I don't see a lot of people talking about. Okay. One other good thing I'll mention, Feely Swanson, that fight delivered. Glad to see they got their performance of the night bonus. That fight was great. Good notice. That's a great prelim fight that they put on there. Got to agree with that. Okay, now let's get to something else. Peyton Talbot. Great to see Peyton Talbot get a highlight reel finish. The thing that, again, I don't see a lot of people talking about is he was a huge favorite going into this fight. Now, people are talking about, him getting all these big fights and stuff. And look, Adrian Yanez, I think, is a step in the right direction. Yanez isn't ranked. I think that's the type of fight you should do for Peyton Talbot right now. But people got to mention that he was a huge favorite going into this fight. Like, he was supposed to win. Like, the results should not be too surprising when you're a minus 1,600 favorite. There was kind of this narrative on Saturday that he beat a really good opponent. Yeah, he's 12-2, but like, this is a guy who lost his UFC debut. I don't know the type of opposition he was fighting going into this. That's another thing where I think that people are kind of overhyping Talbot a little bit because they're not looking at who he's fighting. When you're a minus 1,600 favorite, this is the type of stuff you're supposed to do. 19 seconds, very impressive. I'll give him that. And this isn't to downplay Peyton Talbot. I'm just talking about people who aren't looking at the optics of that. He was supposed to win like this. He really was. If you're minus 1,600, you're supposed to go out there and finish like this. So that's another thing where I think the UFC could have done a better job of the matchmaking here, give a more competitive fight. Yes, we got a highlight reel finish out of it. That's great, but he was sort of supposed to do this if you sort of look at the odds there. So there's that. Okay, Jillian Robertson, Michelle Waterson-Gomez. To be fair, I didn't think Robertson was going to beat down Jillian Robertson was going to beat down Waterson this badly. But you look at Waterson's face, you kind of look back on this matchmaking. Was this fight even necessary? I mean, again, Robertson absolutely beat the brakes off Waterson. It's not the first time we've seen Waterson battered like this in a fight. And she rightfully retired, which was great. It's the end of the road. Waterson's had a great career. She's fought the who's who. But, going into this fight, Michelle Waterson had lost 5 in a row. I mean, you don't really see that much in the UFC. And going back even further, she's lost, 7 of her last 6. And the only fight she won was a split decision. That was not fun to watch, to see Waterson get beat up that badly. Looking back now, UFC probably shouldn't have let Waterson fight again. She's 38. It was nice to see her, get a montage at the end in her retirement. I thought that was good. But this was a fight, kind of looking back now, I don't think really needed to be made. I think Robertson should have fought someone else. It was very clear that Waterson just doesn't have it anymore. Maybe, listen, to be fair, I didn't think Robertson was going to beat down Waterson this badly, but it just wasn't fun to watch. To see someone like Waterson, who's been in the UFC so long, end her career like that was a little bit tough. Speaking of fighter montages, we didn't get one for this fight with Arlovsky and Martin Buday, which, by the way, ended up who booked this fight? This was not a good, this was probably the worst fight on the card. And listen, all the respect to every fighter that steps in the cage. You know, I'm not going to sit here and bash the fighters, but it's just, I mean, looking at the matchmaking going in, I think we all expected this to not be a great fight, and this was by far the worst fight on the card. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part is that might be Andrei Arlovski's last fight. I went and looked. He made his UFC debut in November of 2000. That's not a mistake or a typo. 2000. He's been in the UFC for 24 years. He did fight, obviously, in Affliction and some other promotions, but he's, you know, he basically made his debut, 24 years ago. Well, a little less than 24 years ago. That's crazy. This guy should have got a montage. You know, and Dana White's kind of like, well, it's the last fight on his deal. We don't really know what's going to happen. I mean, if that's the end of the road for Arlovski, that guy of all people deserves a montage. He's a former champion. That's something Waterson didn't even do. Arlovski actually won the heavyweight title back in the day. I don't know that, like, I didn't like the matchmaking here, and I didn't like the fact there was no montage at the end, because it pretty much is Arlovski's last fight. Dana White didn't seem to indicate that Arlovski would be back. That was a bit disappointing as well. And again, something I don't see a lot of people talking about. This guy of all people, Arlovski, should be getting a send-off here. So what wasn't a fan of that as well. And that's pretty much it. I mean, again, this whole video is not about, you know, bashing the UFC or anything like that. It's just, there's a lot of stuff that people aren't talking about what came out of UFC 303. And I think it's worth discussing here. And, that's kind of the point of why I made this video, is that I think the UFC's got to do a better job of building up these cards, so we won't come into these situations where we get fights on short notice. So I want to know what you guys think in the comment section below. Any of these points you agree with here? Look, am I glad that I got to see a card and the whole thing wasn't canceled? Absolutely. But I would like the UFC to do a better job of building up their cards and not getting these short notice fights. Like, no one seems to care that Pereira and Prochazka was on short notice. Yes, it helped the card. It made the card better. But if the UFC had just done planning a little bit better in building up the McGregor card, not relying so much on McGregor, I think that's what they did. I think they thought, doesn't matter, McGregor's fighting, you know, we don't need a strong card. But you're also talking about a guy McGregor who hasn't fought in a while and has been known to have some issues with the UFC as far as his contract and other stuff. So it's like, you know, you should have had a better backup plan. That's my big critique here. And I've said it before, the UFC just does too many events. If they didn't do as many events, they would be able to have better solutions where fighters can have full camps. They can make stronger cards. That's what would happen in a situation like this, in my opinion. Too many times this year, we've seen short notice fights ruin really good opportunities. I mentioned Islam and Volk. That's a fight that should have got a big build up to the rematch. You got Gaethje and Holloway, which, yes, amazing fight. But where does Justin Gaethje go from here? He has to watch a guy that he knocked out get a title shot against Islam, a title shot that he should have had. Again, because the UFC needed to put something big together for UFC 300. So that's kind of my complaint. Look, the UFC with the TV deal, they pretty much have to do the amount of events they're doing. I understand that. It's a business. They have to put cards together and make cards exciting, or they have to just put cards on regardless, right? So that's going to really limit in what you're able to do. But I don't know. I just think, like, at the end of the day, there's fighters that are suffering. I think fans are suffering. They're, you know, again, you paid to see a Conor McGregor, you paid to see a good card. And in my opinion, you didn't get a great card as well. So that's kind of my overall thoughts on the card. This just, this card, you know, look, I'm happy I got to cover it. I'm happy I got a lot of interviews and everything, but it just left a bit of a bad taste in my mouth. And I feel like people are just accepting what it was and just ignoring everything else. And I think for a guy like Yuri and even a guy like Diego Lopez, who nearly lost, or, you know, could have lost that fight, I should say, that's where I kind of feel for those fighters. So I want to know what you guys think in the comment section below. Do you agree, disagree? Let's discuss this card. I want to hear your points. Maybe you agree with some of the stuff I said. Maybe you don't. Let me know in the comments. We'd love to have a discussion with you. Follow me on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, @Lynch on Sports. My name is James Lynch. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.